What is a servant girl worth? Not in wages, those can be counted, and in 1871 they amounted to almost nothing. A few shillings a week and a bed in the coldest room of the house. Not in sentiment, the Victorians were sentimental about many things, about dogs and orphans and the deserving poor. But they were rarely sentimental about the girl who lit their fires and emptied their chamber pots. What is she worth when she is alive? And what is she worth when she is dead? And is there a difference? And if so, who decides? On the morning of the 26th of April, 1871, a Saturday, in the hours before dawn, a young woman was found on her hands and knees in a muddy lane on the outskirts of London. She had been beaten with a plasterer's hammer. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. Her brain was visible through a wound in her forehead. She was 17 years old, she was pregnant, and her name was Jane Maria Clouson. She had been a domestic servant in the household of a prosperous Greenwich printer. She had been dismissed 2 weeks earlier. She had told her aunt she was going to meet someone that evening, the son of her former employer. She came back on a stretcher, carried to Guy's Hospital, where she lay for 4 days without regaining consciousness. On the 30th of April, she died. The man she is believed to have gone to meet, the man whose name she may have whispered before she lost the ability to speak, was Edmund Walter Pook, 20 years old, the son of the house she had served. He was arrested. He was tried at the Old Bailey. He was acquitted. And the question of what a servant girl was worth was answered, in that courtroom, with a clarity that the whole of England heard, and that a great many people in England refused to accept. This is the story of that question and that answer. It is the story of a lane so remote that it was chosen precisely because no one would hear the screaming. It is the story of a hammer purchased days before it was used. It is the story of a verdict that emptied a courtroom of justice and filled the streets outside with rage. And it is, above all, the story of a girl whose monument still stands in a South London cemetery, paid for by people who never knew her but who understood that if no one remembered Jane Maria Clouson, then the answer to the question, what is a servant girl worth, would be nothing at all. There are names that history buried on purpose, names that belonged to women who had no title, no fortune, no voice that the powerful were required to hear. This channel exists to speak those names again. If the stories of the silenced and the forgotten are the ones you came here for, then you are in exactly the right place. Stay with us. Jane Maria Clouson was born on the 27th of April, 1854, in a cramped terrace house at number 44 New King Street, Deptford, a working-class district on the south bank of the Thames where the river smelled of tar and timber and the streets were loud with the traffic of the Royal Dockyard. Her father was James Clouson, a laboring man whose trade history has not troubled itself to record. Her mother, also named Jane, was the center of a household that poverty held together and disease would pull apart. Jane's older sister, Sarah, died of consumption in 1863. Jane was 9 years old. 4 years later, her mother followed. Jane was 13. Her father, whether by death or disappearance, drops out of the record around the same period. By the time she was 14 years old, Jane Maria Clouson was, in the phrase the Victorians used with a precision that was both descriptive and dismissive, a motherless girl. She had no inheritance. She had no connections. She had no education beyond what the parish could provide. What she had was a pair of hands and a willingness to work. And in the London of 1868, those two things were exactly sufficient to secure a position as a maid of all work in a household that required someone to perform every task that its respectable members considered beneath them. The household that employed her belonged to Ebenezer Witcher Pook, a printer who operated a business on London Street in Greenwich. Ebenezer had connections to the Times of London, which placed him securely in the tier of Victorian tradesman respectability that measured its worth in propriety, regularity, and the careful maintenance of appearances. His wife was Mary. Their children included several sons, among them an eldest who had already committed the domestic crime of marrying beneath his station, and a younger son named Edmund Walter, born in Walworth in 1851, who was 3 years older than the new servant and who suffered, by his own later account, from epileptic fits. Jane entered the Pook household and vanished into the invisible machinery of domestic service. She was described in later testimony as rather a good-looking girl, clean, respectable, hard-working, and industrious. She slept in the servants' quarters. She rose before dawn. She cleaned and cooked and carried and scrubbed and answered bells and opened doors and did everything that was required of her without complaint and without recognition. Because that was what a servant did, and because, for a motherless girl from Deptford with no family and no prospects, there was no alternative. Somewhere in the daily proximity of a household that placed a young servant and a young gentleman's son under the same roof, a relationship began between Jane Clouson and Edmund Pook. The word affair implies equality, and equality is not quite the right frame for what passed between a maid-of-all-work and the son of her employer. Whether Edmund courted Jane or simply took what his position in the household made available to him is a question that the trial would later approach but never answer. What is certain is that by the early months of 1871, when Jane was 16 and Edmund was 20, the relationship had produced a consequence that could not be concealed indefinitely. Jane was pregnant. On the 13th of April 1871, Ebenezer Pook dismissed Jane from service. The family's public explanation was that her work had deteriorated, that she had become slovenly and unkempt, that her manner had grown unpleasant. The explanation that circulated outside the household was simpler and more damning. Ebenezer had discovered the pregnancy or the relationship or both and had removed Jane from the house to prevent the possibility that Edmund might follow his older brother's example and marry beneath the family's station. The servant was the problem. The servant was removed. The problem, the family assumed, was solved. Jane went to live with her aunt Elizabeth Trott at 12 Ashburnham Road, Greenwich. She was 16 years old, dismissed without a reference, pregnant and alone. The police would later claim that she and Edmund continued to correspond in secret, that letters passed between them, and that Edmund agreed to meet her on the evening of the 25th of April to discuss their situation. None of these letters were ever recovered. Their existence was asserted but never proven. What is known is that on the evening of the 25th of April, Jane told her aunt she was going out. She did not say where. She did not come home. Kidbrooke Lane in 1871 was among the most remote and desolate places in metropolitan London. It ran from Eltham toward Morden College through open, unlit marshland, bordered by ditches and hedgerows, with no houses nearby and no gaslight to disturb the darkness. Contemporary illustrations suggest that whoever brought Jane to this spot chose it deliberately, precisely because it offered isolation, because a cry for help would reach no one, because the darkness itself was an accomplice. Constable Donald Gunn, walking his beat in the early hours of the 26th, found Jane on her hands and knees on the soft, wet ground at the side of the lane. She was moaning, "Oh, my poor head, my poor head." He knelt beside her. He asked what had happened. She did not answer. He placed his hand on her shoulder and shook her gently. She raised her left hand and whispered, "Take hold of my hand," and as she turned her head he saw the full extent of what had been done to her. The blood, the fracture, the brain protruding through the wound in her forehead. He reached for her. She fell forward onto her face. "Let me die." The house surgeon at Guy's Hospital, Michael Harris, documented the injuries with the vocabulary of a profession trained to describe the unthinkable in measured terms. 12 to 14 separate wounds to the head and face, all clean incised cuts, consistent with a sharp-edged heavy instrument. The left temporal bone smashed and depressed, the bone above the right eye completely destroyed, fragments lying loose, brain matter protruding. The upper lip split to the jawbone, which was broken. Defensive wounds on both hands and the backs of both arms, the unmistakable signature of a person who had tried to shield herself from blows she could not escape. Jane Clouson was also pregnant, approximately 2 months along. The child was already dead, and had been for roughly 2 weeks, its death coinciding approximately with the date of Jane's dismissal from the Pook household. A blood-stained plasterer's hammer was found in the grounds of nearby Morden College. The hammer had been wiped but not cleaned. It was traced to a tool shop on the High Street in Deptford. The Metropolitan Police acted with the speed of men who believed the case was clear. Inspector John Mulvaney of the Detective Branch at Scotland Yard arrested Edmund Walter Pook at his father's place of business on the afternoon of the 30th of April, the same day Jane died. The Times reported the arrest the following morning in language that left little doubt about the paper's assessment of the situation. The accused was the son of a very respectable tradesman. The deceased had lived as a domestic servant in the family of the father of the accused for a period of 1 year and 10 months. She had left this situation a fortnight ago, being pregnant at the time. Acting upon information that the deceased, on leaving her lodgings on the night previous to her body being found, had remarked that she was going to meet the son of her late master, the accused was taken into custody. When told the charge, he declared himself innocent. The evidence was circumstantial but dense. A man matching Edmund's description had been seen running from Kidbrooke Lane. His clothing bore bloodstains which he attributed to biting his tongue during a fit. A scratch marked his left arm. The shopkeeper at the Deptford tool shop identified Edmund as the customer who had purchased the hammer several days before the murder. 7 witnesses stated they had seen Jane and Edmund together on Kidbrooke Lane that evening. And before she lost consciousness, Jane herself had reportedly spoken 2 words. Edmund Pook. The coroner's court heard this evidence and returned a verdict of willful murder against Edmund Walter Pook. The case was committed to the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. It opened on the 10th of July, 1871. The distance between evidence and a verdict is sometimes measured in facts, and sometimes it is measured in something else entirely, in the weight of a family name, in the cost of a barrister, in the silence that settles over a courtroom when the accused is respectable and the victim was not. This channel exists to walk that distance and to ask the questions that the courts did not. If that is what you came here for, then you are part of something that matters more than you know. The trial of Edmund Walter Pook lasted 5 days and was presided over by Sir William Boville, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas. The prosecution was led by John Coleridge, Solicitor General of England, assisted by Mr. Poland and Mr. Archibald. The defense was conducted by John Walter Huddleston, Queen's Counsel, a barrister whose reputation for ruthless cross-examination was matched only by his fees. The first blow fell before a single witness had taken the stand. The judge ruled that all statements made by Jane Clouson before her death, including her identification of Edmund Pook as her attacker, were hearsay and therefore inadmissible. The dying words of the victim were struck from the record. The one person who knew with certainty what had happened in Kidbrooke Lane was silenced a second time, not by a hammer but by a point of law. The defense then dismantled the remaining evidence piece by piece with the patient. Surgical efficiency of a team that knew precisely which threads to pull. The shopkeeper's identification of Edmund as the purchaser of the hammer was challenged, and it became apparent that the identification was less certain than the prosecution had implied. The 7 witnesses who placed Jane and Edmund together on the lane were subjected to cross-examination that revealed inconsistencies and contradictions. Edmund's explanation for the bloodstains on his clothing, the bitten tongue during an epileptic fit, was presented not as a desperate excuse but as a plausible medical fact. The letters between Jane and Edmund, upon which the prosecution's theory of a continuing secret relationship depended, could not be produced. They had never been found. Their existence rested entirely on the testimony of Jane's relatives and acquaintances, and that testimony, the defense argued, was not evidence, but rumor. The prosecution had built its case on the assumption that the accumulation of circumstantial details would form a picture so clear that no jury could ignore it. The defense bet that if each detail was examined in isolation, each could be made to wobble. They were right. On the 15th of July, after 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. The crowd that had gathered outside the Old Bailey received the news with an anger that the police had anticipated but could not contain. The verdict was not merely unpopular. It was experienced. In the streets and the newspapers and the pubs and the parlors of southeast London, as a confirmation of something the working people of the city had always suspected but rarely seen demonstrated with such naked clarity, that justice in Victorian England was a commodity, available to those who could afford it and withheld from those who could not. A servant girl had been beaten to death. The son of a respectable tradesman had been charged. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the system had found a way to let him go. The Times published an editorial on the 18th of July that attempted to steer a careful course between defending the verdict and acknowledging the public's fury. A parliamentary question was raised 2 days later. Pamphlets were printed and distributed on the streets of Greenwich and Deptford openly accusing Edmund Pook of murder. Edmund, through his solicitor, brought criminal libel suits against the pamphleteers and won £50 in damages. But during the civil proceedings he was compelled to answer questions that the criminal trial had not permitted, and every answer deepened the suspicion that the jury had chosen not to see what was plainly in front of them. A public committee was formed to raise the £50. They raised it easily. The people of Deptford and Greenwich and Eltham were not confused about what had happened. They paid the fine as an act of collective defiance. Edmund and his family fled London. They changed their names. They disappeared into the interior of a country that offered anonymity to those with the means to purchase it. Edmund Walter Pook died in 1920, at the age of 69. Under a name that history has not preserved, in a place that history has not recorded. He was never held accountable for the death of Jane Maria Clouson. The funeral of Jane Maria Clouson was a public event on a scale that the authorities had not anticipated and could barely control. The route from Elizabeth Trott's house in Deptford to Brockley and Ladywell Cemetery was lined with thousands of mourners, so densely packed that the police were deployed to maintain order. Jane's coffin was carried on a horse-drawn carriage, and as it passed, people threw flowers onto the carriage and into the path of the horses, a spontaneous carpet of petals laid down by strangers for a girl whose family could not afford a memorial. The pallbearers were all women. They wore the uniforms of domestic servants. It was a gesture so deliberate, so precisely aimed at the heart of the injustice that had been done, that even the newspapers, which had by this point exhausted their vocabulary for outrage, paused to describe it. These were the women who did the same work Jane had done, who lit the same fires and scrubbed the same floors and endured the same invisibility, and they carried her to her grave in their working clothes, because they understood that Jane's story was not an anomaly. It was the story of every maid in every household in every street in London. The story of what could happen when the son of the house wanted something and the servant had no power to refuse. The public committee that had raised the money for the libel damages also collected subscriptions for a memorial. The monument they erected at Brockley Cemetery is a stone pillar crowned with the figure of a kneeling child in prayer. Beneath it, the inscription reads, "A motherless girl who was murdered in Kidbrooke Lane, Eltham, age 17, in 1871. Her last words were, 'Oh, let me die.'" The monument is Grade 2, listed by English Heritage. It has survived 150 years of weather, 2 world wars, the Blitz, the obliteration of the lane where Jane was killed, and the transformation of the surrounding neighborhood from open marshland to dense suburb. It is still there. The figure still prays. The inscription is still legible. And the flowers that strangers leave at its base still appear from time to time without explanation. Kidbrooke Lane no longer exists as it did in 1871. The construction of the A2 road in the early 1920s cut through the old lane and reconfigured the geography of the area entirely. The spot where Jane was found is now part of Rochester Way, a busy arterial road flanked by residential streets and traffic. The open marshland, the ditches, the hedgerows, the darkness that made the lane so perfectly suited to murder, all of it is gone, paved over, built upon, absorbed into the ordinary noise of a city that has always preferred to grow over its wounds rather than examine them. For decades after the murder, Kidbrooke Lane was haunted. Patrolling policemen reported seeing a young woman in a white dress at the edge of the road, her face streaked with blood. Her cries were heard in the darkness, first the words, "Oh, my poor head, my poor head," and then the groan of a body falling, and then silence. The sightings continued until the lane was finally developed, and when the houses arrived, the ghost departed, as though what had held her there was not the place itself, but the emptiness of the place. The same emptiness that had made it possible for someone to beat a 17-year-old girl nearly to death and walk away without being seen. The journalist Halborough Denham, writing in the January 1898 issue of London Society, argued that the failure of the Pook prosecution had broken something inside the Metropolitan Police. The overzealous pursuit of Edmund, the embarrassment of the acquittal, the public excoriation that followed, all of it had taught Scotland Yard a lesson it learned too well: to be cautious, to hold back, to temper its pursuit of suspects rather than risk another humiliation. Denham traced a line from the Clouson case through a catalogue of unsolved London murders. Harriet Buswell in 1872, the squire's mother and daughter the same year, Charles Bravo in 1876, all the way to the 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper in Whitechapel in 1888. The police had tried too hard to convict the man who killed Jane Clouson, and because they failed, Denham argued, they never tried hard enough again. Whether Denham was right is a question for historians. What is not a question is the silence that settled over Kidbrooke Lane after the verdict. A silence that belonged not to the absence of sound, but to the absence of justice. Jane Maria Clouson was 17. She was a maid. She was a motherless girl carrying a child that would never draw breath. She was beaten with a hammer on the darkest lane in southeast London and left to die on her hands and knees in the mud. The man she named as her killer was tried and set free. The case was never solved. A laborer in Australia confessed years later. Scotland Yard dismissed the confession without investigation. The file was closed. The lane was paved. The ghost, they say, is gone, but the monument remains. And the inscription on it, her last words, 7 syllables, 5 of them monosyllabic, plain as a child's prayer and heavy as a stone, says everything that the Old Bailey did not. Oh, let me die. Some stories end with a verdict. This one ends with a monument paid for by strangers. standing in a South London cemetery, still praying, still waiting, still asking a question that England answered wrong in 1871 and has never gone back to correct.